Alrighty, y'all. So now we're going to take a look at units 3 and 4. Explain why the law of diminishing marginal returns occurs. So we can think back to that chain link activity that we did in here. As we added more workers, the additional units that we produced, the marginal product started to go down eventually. And that's because we have more variable resources using the same fixed resources. So if I, let's say, have a kitchen with one oven in it and I hire one worker, great. Hiring a second worker is probably going to make me better off. They can specialize. Hiring a third worker and a fourth worker and a fifth worker to share that oven probably will still work. But after a certain point, when I have 10 people trying to use that same oven, the additional returns that I'm going to get for each worker is going to be less because they're sharing those same fixed resources. So diminishing marginal returns happens because as we produce more and more of a good, it gets increasingly difficult to make that. Explain why ATC and AVC never intersect. It's because you're always going to have the average fixed cost, right? Average total cost is the fixed plus the variable. And so while they'll get closer together, right, as we produce more, our average fixed cost gets lower and lower. So these two curves get closer and closer together. There's always going to be some value there, right? That if we have a fixed cost of $500 for an oven, no matter how many pizzas I make, there's still going to be an average fixed cost, even though it might be low. Explain why average total cost always hits marginal cost at the lowest point of the ATC curve. Right, we've got our marginal cost curve, and then we've got our average total cost. And that marginal cost is always going to cross at the lowest point because the marginal cost is looking at the additional cost of each unit. And if that additional cost is higher than the average, it's going to bring up the average. Same thing as it would with your grades. If you have an 80 average and you get an 85 on the next test, your test average goes up. If you get a 75 on the next test, that brings your average down. So if the marginal cost is higher than average, it brings it up. If the marginal cost is lower than the average, it brings it down. All right, the difference between economies of scale and diseconomies of scale is what's happening to that average total cost. So if average total cost is going down as you produce more, that would be our economies of scale. Think back to like Sam's Club there, that the bigger they get, the cheaper they can produce. This diseconomies of scale is saying that as you produce more, the average total cost is going up, right? So if you're looking at Sam's Club or Costco or whatever, they are these massive stores that produce everything in bulk and in scale, but even they have a limit, right? They know that if they produce any bigger, any larger, that eventually it's going to get unwieldy or difficult to manage. And that average total cost is going to start to go up. All right, explain why accounting profit is positive while economic profit is zero. This is one that we struggled with a little bit in class. All right, and the reason behind this is economic profit is the revenue minus the explicit and the implicit costs. Right, so all of the bills that you're paying, the resource costs, whatever, the explicit, plus the opportunity cost. So if I make $100,000 at my company this year, and my explicit costs are $40,000, that's the bills I'm having to pay. And let's say that I'm giving up my job as a teacher. I'm giving up the $60,000 that I could be making teaching. My economic profit would be zero. I made $100,000, I spent $100,000. Accounting profit, though, is just looking at the explicit. So the revenue would be $100,000, my explicit cost would be $40,000, and so I'd be making an accounting profit of $60,000. So the accounting profit's always larger because it's not taking into account the implicit costs. And so what we generally think about that with is what firms should enter or exit the market. So a firm could be making an accounting profit. You know, gas stations make money for their owners, but there's no other incentive for other gas stations to enter into that market in the long run because they're not making any economic profits. If more firms were to enter into the market, A, their revenue would go down, and B, their implicit costs would go up. So we call this normal profits, that in the long run, a perfect competition, a monopolistic competition, they make zero economic profits, but they're still making accounting profits, because the accounting profits aren't taking into account the implicit costs. All right, explain why firms should shut down when price falls below the AVC. So this average variable cost, think of this as the resources to make a good, right? if the average variable cost, like let's just say the beef that goes into making a burger, if the beef alone costs me $3 to make a burger, then maybe it's worth it for me to sell the burger for $4 or $5 or $6 or $7. But it's not worth it for me to sell that burger for less than $3, because then the resources to make it are always going to outweigh what I'm selling it for. So if the price goes below the average variable cost, that's when we shut down. And by shut down, we don't mean shut down for good. We just mean that we stop producing. Explain why perfectly competitive firms are both allocatively and productively efficient. Right? So if we're looking at this perfect competition, prices, quantity, marginal cost curve, average total cost curve, and we've got our, let's say to start out with our demand curve up here. So demand and marginal revenue are the same. So we're producing right here. Right now, this firm's making a profit. Their revenue is greater than their costs. Now, what's going to happen in the long run is that if this firm's making a profit, other firms will keep entering into this market, driving down prices until we get to this average total cost. Right? Then we're at that break-even point. All right, now, why these firms are allocative and productively efficient? They're allocatively efficient because they're producing at a point where supply and demand meet, right? We've got our demand curve, our marginal cost is our supply curve. We're meeting people's needs. It's productively efficient because it's at the lowest average total cost. So allocatively efficient, supply and demand are meeting. Productively efficient, we're producing at the lowest average total cost. Because if we're making a profit, firms will keep entering in the market and driving down the prices. And that kind of gets to 24. Explain why perfectly competitive firms make no economic profit in the long run. It's because more firms would enter, which drives down prices. So in the short run, they can make a profit. But if they're making money, because there's no barriers to entry, other firms will keep entering into the market until they get back to equilibrium. All right, and explain the difference between a constant cost industry and an increasing cost industry. So the idea behind this is, for a constant cost industry, more firms won't change the cost to produce. Think about like streaming services for this, right? If Disney Plus expands their library and adds more movies, that doesn't affect Paramount Plus's or HBO Max's ability to make movies, right? One firm entering into the market isn't going to affect the cost of the others. All right, an increasing cost industry, they're fighting over resources. So the example there, if we're looking at Georgia Power, they use nuclear material and coal to produce electricity. So if another company were to enter into their market, they would have a demand for that coal and that nuclear material as well, driving up the cost of those resources. So an increasing cost industry, new firms are going to affect the cost of the existing firms. All right, and for Unit 4, explain why demand is greater than marginal revenue for all imperfectly competitive firms. This should say for non-price discriminating firms. And the reason for that is, if we're lowering prices, we lower it for the new and the old. So let's say that we're looking at the price being $10, $9, $8. The quantity of them selling is 1 unit, 2 units, 3 units. Total revenue, if I sell 1 unit for $10, I'm going to make 10. If I sell 2 units for 9, I'm going to make 18. If I sell 3 units for 8, I'm going to make 24. Now, if we're looking at my marginal revenue, right, this first unit would be 10. But the second unit, I'm only making $8 more than I was before. The third unit, I'm only making $6 more than I was before. And that's because I had to lower the price of both the new units and the old units as well. So that marginal revenue is always going to be lower than our demand curve, because I'm lowering the prices of the new units and the old units. Explain why demand is elastic when marginal revenue is positive. All right, it's because raising prices lowers the total revenue, and lowering prices increases the total revenue. So let's look at this on a graph here. Price, quantity, got our demand curve here, and got our marginal revenue curve here, which eventually is going to go negative, right? So as I am, like let's say we're looking at 1 unit, 2 units, 3 units here. All right, so selling this first unit, my let's call it $5, $10, $20. Selling this first unit at $20, my marginal revenue is positive. I'm going to make $20 more. If I lower my price down, now my marginal revenue is $10 at 2 units. So that's $10 more than I had before. Right? If I go to 3 units, now it's at $5. That's $5 more than I had before. But if I produce beyond 3 units, my marginal revenue is going to start to go negative. So by lowering my prices down anymore, I'm going to start losing money off of that. So the total revenue test tells us that if we lower our prices and our total revenue goes down, it would be inelastic. If we raise our prices and our total revenue goes down, then it would be elastic. Right? So by raising my prices from $10 to $20, I'm leaving money on the table. Fewer people are buying my goods. This money, even though my marginal revenue is going down, it's still positive. I'm still making more money. I know it's kind of a weird concept, but that does come up every now and then on the AP test. All right, explain how to identify the profit maximizing point in quantity for a monopoly. So the quantity, we use Mr. Mac, right, where marginal revenue meets marginal cost. Right, that helps us identify where we're going to make the most money. For price, we go up to the demand curve, right? So if we're looking at this hypothetical curve here, marginal cost, we've got our demand, and we've got our marginal revenue. So our quantity is going to be where Mr. Mac meets, right? That's our profit maximizing quantity. Then I'm going to go up to this demand curve to figure out what my price is, because the demand curve is telling me at what price people are willing to buy this good. Explain why an unregulated monopoly generates dead weight loss. It's because they're producing less and at a higher price than the socially optimal point. So the socially optimal point, like that's kind of our base for dead weight loss, right? Are we producing enough and are we producing it at the right price? But if we think about a profit maximizing monopoly, right, they're going to produce wherever they're making the most money, and generally that is less than the socially optimal point and at a higher price than the socially optimal point. Explain why monopolies can earn a positive economic profit in the long run. The perfect competitions couldn't, and it was because businesses could enter and exit the market. Now what stops businesses from entering and exiting the market in a monopoly are these barriers to entry. It could be a patent, it could be a copyright, it could be the ownership of a resource, but these barriers to entry prevent competition from entering or exiting the market. So the difference between a natural monopoly and a regular monopoly. So a natural monopoly, one firm can supply all the demand. At a point where average total cost is going down. Right, so if we think about Georgia Power with this, right, it makes sense for them to have a monopoly, because if other companies were to enter into the market, it would drive up the costs and it would make them less productive or less efficient. So that they can produce it at a point, maybe not necessarily at the lowest average total cost. They can supply all the demand at a lower price than multiple firms. Right? If other electric companies entered into the market, that would drive up the price of electricity. A regular monopoly is just going to form because of barriers to entry. Right? You know, they've got something preventing other companies from entering into the market. Explain why a price discriminating monopoly generates more than a non-price discriminating monopoly. It's because they can charge everyone the max amount, right? In a non-price discriminating monopoly, they've got to charge everybody the same amount. But with this price discriminating monopoly, everyone will get charged the maximum amount, so the quantity is going to be higher, right? They can raise prices for people that really want the good, and they can lower down the prices for people that wouldn't normally buy the good. So the quantity is going to be higher, and they're making the maximum profit they can for everybody. There's no consumer surplus. The difference between a monopoly and a monopolistic competition is monopoly has barriers to entry, and a monopolistic competition wouldn't. Right, so if we're looking at, let's say, fast food restaurants in town, there's no barriers to entry for that. All you would need is a business license. It's like $35. You could open up your own food truck if you want. You could sell hot dogs on the side of the street if you want. There's not a lot of barriers into that market. Monopoly, you've got something preventing that competition. Monopolistic competition, they do have some control over their prices, but in the long run, they wouldn't. Like in the long run, monopolistic competition isn't going to make a profit because firms will enter into that market to try to eat up some of that profit. And that kind of takes it to 34. Price equals ATC in the long run for monopolistic competition, because if they're making a profit, just like with the perfect competition, other firms will enter into that market. So we could do the side-by-side graph here. Price, quantity, demand, supply. You got the equilibrium price. And let's say that we're looking at a monopolistic competition here. Demand curve, marginal revenue, average total cost. So they're making a profit here. If they're making a profit, more firms will want to enter into the market, driving down the price of the goods. The demand for my business is going to go down because there's more competitors, and it's going to go down until we're at that average total cost, until we're at that break-even point. I know it's kind of hard to read that graph right there, but the reason is because the same thing as the perfect competition. Firms will enter into the market, lowering demand for my firm. Explain why a monopolistically competitive firm doesn't produce the quantity that is productively efficient. It's because they're at the profit maximizing point. Right? They're going to produce wherever they think they can make the most money, not necessarily where the average total cost is lowest. A cartel versus a regular oligopoly. A cartel is colluding. They're working together to set their prices higher. You could think back to the drug cartels there. They're deliberately working together to make a bigger profit, whereas the regular oligopolies, in theory, would be competing. Right? They're not actively working together. They're undercutting each other. Now, when we're looking at this dominant strategy versus Nash equilibrium, let's just kind of draw out a little grid to kind of recap over it real quick. All right, let's say that we've got firm X and firm Y, and they can raise or lower their prices. All right, so let's say the matrix we're looking at 50-30, 70-50, 20-60, and 30-20. All right, so the way that we would read this, first off for the dominant strategy, we're trying to figure out if a firm is always going to have a clear-cut decision to make. So if firm Y decides to raise their prices, firm X has a choice between raising or lowering their prices. They would raise them. And if firm Y decides to lower their prices, firm X still has that same choice of raising or lowering. They would, in this case, raise their prices. So if they're going to raise their prices either way, we would say that they'd have a dominant strategy. It doesn't matter what firm Y does, firm X is going to raise. Now, if we're looking at firm Y, if firm X decides to lower their prices, firm Y has a choice of raising or lowering them, in which case they would raise them. But if firm X raises their prices, firm Y has a choice of raising or lowering, they would lower it. So in that case, firm Y wouldn't have a dominant strategy. Their choice is going to be based on what firm X decides to do. So the dominant strategy is just a decision that's always best. The Nash equilibrium is if they have no incentive to change their strategy independently. And let's take a look at this. So if firm X is going to raise their prices because they have that dominant strategy, we know that firm Y is going to lower their prices, because if they raise their prices, or they're going to lower their prices, because if firm Y raised their prices, they would make less than if they lowered them. So let's say that we're in a Nash equilibrium here. Let's test it. So right now, firm X is going high and firm Y is going low. If firm Y switched to raising their prices, they would lose money. All right, so they don't have an incentive to change. All right, right now firm Y is going low. If firm X switched to low, they go from making $70 to $30. They don't have any incentive to change. So in that case, we would call this a Nash equilibrium. Right? Neither party has a move that they can make that's going to put them any better off than they were before. All right, see you guys for Unit 5 and 6.